The Unfiltered by Jade.
Jade. Welcome to The Unfiltered by Jade, where we educate, empower, and entertain. Feel free to like, share, subscribe, download, donate, and make everybody know about this.
Beats by RB Records.
Shopping assistance, your style, your budget. Our services include online and local shopping for individuals and businesses, personal shopping, purchasing of company and office supplies, importing and exporting small packages across Jamaica and worldwide, and helping you find unique gifts and items for all events and occasions. Contact us at 876-919-5195 or shoppingassistance2015@gmail.com. Shopping Assistance, your style, your budget.
Welcome back to The Unfiltered by Jade. Today we have with us here Tim Coetzee, and I am here to speak about, well, we are both here to speak about MS. This is something I've just recently learned about, and I think he's a perfect person to speak to us about this conversation. So hi, Tim.
Hi, Jade. Pleasure to be with you and your audience.
Thank you. And let me give you a little background about him. So the Chief Advocacy Services and Science Officer for the National MS Society. Perfect. Yes. So want to get into it first. I want you to let our audience know what is multiple sclerosis, which we know as MS, and what causes it.
A couple of great questions. So why don't we start with what it is? So multiple sclerosis, or MS, as you noted, is a disease of a person's brain and their spinal cord, where the flow of information from our brain and our spinal cord to the rest of the body gets disrupted. And, basically the short, I think an easy way to think about it is, as I'm talking to you, you ask that question, I heard the question, my brain processes it, and then it tells my mouth to start answering your question. And all of that kind of coordination, right? There's a network of wires that can, our nerves that connect the brain to the mouth and all of that. And in MS, what's happening is that those connections are being cut, damaged in different ways in different parts of a person's brain. And, some of those things that we often take for granted get disrupted. And so that's sort of broadly speaking what it means.
Okay.
Its cause, that's a different big question. What we don't know is the exact and precise cause that says this is the thing that causes MS. What we do know is that it's likely a combination of things. A person's genetic makeup is one thing. So, what their genetics makes them as a person. And then a second factor is, they probably would be exposed to something in the environment as they were growing up. It could be a virus. It could be not having gotten enough sunlight and low vitamin D. Some what we call environmental factor that, it's kind of a lock and key that, that exposure along with the right kind of genetic sort of background contributes to a person developing MS. It's still a bit of a puzzle for us to try to get at the precise cause. We're making progress towards that, but broadly speaking, that's where we are today. Certainly a lot further than we were 20 years ago, but still ways to go.
Still. That's interesting though, because persons would probably want to try and avoid getting it if it is that they know that there are certain things in the environment. But if you don't know, you really can't avoid it.
And I at this point, I would love to say, what we should avoid to not get it. There are some things later in the podcast that we can talk about that if a person is living with MS that I would recommend they avoid. That's a separate question I'm sure your readers may have.
Okay. Sounds good to me. What are some of the common symptoms?
So that's another really great question. And this is one of the challenges with multiple sclerosis is that it shows up in every person in a variety of different ways. And there are some common symptoms that often people will have. And the challenge we have is sometimes those common symptoms are like something else. So for example, they could be constant tingling in your hands. Let's say your hands or your feet, you're experiencing constant tingling or pain over several days that just shows up. That's one possible symptom. Another possible and very common kind of symptom is a person will have trouble. They'll wake up and they have difficulty seeing out of, say, their left eye, but not their right eye, and it just sort of shows up. Um, or they may wake up one day and they have their left leg isn't working and they're dragging their leg. And so these are all what we call neurological signs where your nervous system isn't behaving properly, and they can stay on for a while. And one of the things that makes diagnosing MS complicated is that for example, tingling in your hands could be MS, but it could also be you have a pinched nerve.
That's what
you
I
know
was thinking.
exactly.
Like these different symptoms could be something else.
Exactly. And that is one of the things that oftentimes leads people to not get diagnosed quickly when they have MS is because they go to the doctor and said, oh, let's just watch that because, the tingling could come, could go. And it can be very frustrating for people and sometimes can take them a long time to get confirmed for MS. And if their doctor's not paying attention to getting them into a neurologist, that can lead to a misdiagnosis. The other on the flip side, the other thing too is sometimes if the we'll use the example of blurriness in one eye, that could be MS. But sometimes that could also be a viral infection that affects your eye. You get an inflamed nerve that connects your eye to your brain, but then that resolves itself, and so you don't have MS. You happen to have what they call optic neuritis,
Oh my
and you
goodness.
wouldn't want to start an expensive treatment if you don't need it. So those are it's the frustration about MS. But I will say the good news is, and we can talk a little bit about diagnosing, is that we're getting much better at being able to spot these symptoms and encouraging people to be their own self advocates to get in there to see a doctor, because we are able to diagnose MS much faster than we used to in the past.
That's good. And you had touched on diagnosis for this in terms of this. So we're not to go on Google to search it up and figure out if we have it or not.
Well, if you're going to go on Google, I would recommend visit the National MS Society.org, and we'll give you some good, trusted information. Dr. Google can be useful sometimes, but more often can be wrong and can be scary in terms of
Yes.
some of the symptoms that you could just leap to places where you might not want to leap to
Yes.
early on in the process. So what I would say is the important thing is, like, if someone is experiencing these symptoms, is the important thing is to be your own advocate and not ignore them and just sort of say, oh, the doctor's right, let's just wait and see. I'm not trying to say that doctors aren't very smart and careful. They're trying to be good doctors, but at the same time, as a patient, it's really important to be your own advocate and say, look, I've had this tingling for 3 months now. Maybe I should see a neurologist. And then
Right,
sort
right.
of
Because sometimes trying to explain it to the doctors, they still don't understand what we're saying. And
exactly.
we're the only ones that know what we're feeling.
Exactly. You are your own strongest advocate. And
Right.
let's say you're going to a general practice, a family practice doc. Treating neurology is not their thing, right? They see a wide range of things. And so we encourage people, if you've got vision problems in your eye, for example, and that just showed up and you've had it for at least 24 hours and it doesn't seem to be resolving, get in to your doctor and get referred to a neurologist as quickly as you
Okay.
can.
Okay. That's good. That's good to hear. I don't want anybody saying that they went to Google to check it out and
No,
now
no,
they're panicking. I don't want to
please.
hear that.
No, I mean, Google's very useful for a lot of things, medicine,
not
not so much.
not to check up anything if it is that you're not well. Please don't.
Exactly right. That's precisely right.
Are there different stages though of MS?
Yeah. So maybe before we get to the stages, let me talk about how it's diagnosed, and then I
Sure.
can tell you a bit about how um, the different stages of MS.
Sure.
So one of the things that we can do today is that we're much better at being able to diagnose someone very quickly, much quicker, like within 6 months. And your listeners are wondering, well, why does it take so long? So diagnosing MS today basically involves the doctor sort of spending time with the person, taking a pretty detailed history to understand, have you had other instances of, you blurry vision that you didn't go to the doctor for, but then went away. And why they're being so detailed is what we want to do in diagnosing MS is to make sure that a person's had at least two of what we call these neurological events, like difficulty in the eye, maybe tingling in your hands, and different parts of the person's nervous system, because that tells us there's something up, and that they probably, when it affects more than one place in the nervous system, that probably tells you that there's something that probably points to MS. And then today we also would pair that up with a person getting an MRI, and so they'll put the individual into an MRI, and then they inject a chemical called gadolinium. It's a fancy word for a chemical that basically goes to the damaged parts of the brain and can spot where is the damage.
Mm-hmm.
They're called lesions. And so having these things like symptoms like vision problems and lesions together lead you to the diagnosis of that you have MS. And then in terms of the way the disease shows up in a person, in general, you'll hear us describe that a person has what we call relapsing MS.
Mm-hmm.
And what that means is that they'll have instances where the lesions, or also the clinical signs, so you know having problems walking, or vision problems, appear and then resolve themselves. They show up, you get treated, and then they go away, and so that's what's called a relapse. And those can happen, in the most common instances of MS, probably about 80% of people have that. That's how it'll show up. It'll come and go, and we have treatments for managing that part of the disease. And then the other part we'll call is the way it shows up in individuals at different phase is what we call the more progressive forms of the disease. And what that means when we say progressive MS is that the person isn't having these relapses where the signs of the disease come and go very
Mm-hmm.
strong and then they resolve. Instead, what's happening is that you're slowly over time losing the ability to do certain things. And oftentimes what people will describe it to me is, you know I used to walk just fine, but then after a few years, I needed to use a walking stick, and then maybe 5 or 7 years later, I'm now using a rollator, or I might be using a
Mm.
scooter. And so, rather than the disease being like these very strong episodes that come and go, and in between you're good, the progressive form of the disease, which we have fewer treatments for, is just this sort of steady loss of the things we all take for granted over time, which is part of the frustrating aspect of the work that we've got to solve.
Hmm. So I'm gonna use the word dormant. So when it's dormant, comes and goes. So you want to call it relapsing.
Yeah, so they call it relapsing. Sometimes people will call it benign, but it's not really benign or dormant, because what's happening is the relapses are the most pronounced version, how the disease shows up. But we also know that something's going on in a person's brain. And this is where
Mm.
the treatments we have for MS are really important, about trying to stop the body from attacking the brain. Because what we know is happening in MS is that, in the relapsing form particularly, is that our immune system, which normally does a really great job of preventing infections and helping us fight off COVID, to use that as an example,
Yes,
or
please.
whatever the bad parts of the world coming at
Right.
our body,
Mm-hmm.
fine tuned to fight that off. But for reasons that we still don't know why, our immune system in MS decides to turn against the nervous system and starts to attack the nerve cells. It attacks the insulation that is around our nerve cells, very important insulation around our nerve cells. And so, what the treatments do in relapsing MS is basically slow down that attack by turning down the immune system and basically acting as a brake on the immune system and its attacks on our brain. And so these treatments are really powerful. They've really changed the landscape, but they also are not really effective in the more progressive forms of the disease. And so that's what a lot of our focus is now, is to really figure out, for those individuals who have the more progressive forms, how do we change the trajectory of the disease for them?
That's I don't know, because if it is that persons have the progressive, I mean, they might be living with some of the symptoms and they don't know what it is, because as you
Yeah.
said, the hand tingling, they may say they slept on their hands. They always sleep on their hands and wake up with it tingling. I'm just saying,
Exactly.
so they don't know, and they may at that time have the progressive, but they're not sure, because I wake
Right.
up and my hand tingles every morning, and that's just what happens.
Exactly. Now, what I will say, for you and your audience is that, you know, almost, we estimate that about 85% of people who are diagnosed with MS today have the more relapsing forms of the disease.
Okay.
And so that's the good news aspect of, if there's good news around this, is that most people have relapsing MS. And because today we have all of these treatments, they have the prospect of like not having relapses and a very sort of steady sort of living, management of their life for, decades. There are, as I said, about 15% of people that, have the more are diagnosed from out of the gate with the more progressive form of the disease. And so that's the challenge we have to solve. There is also, one of the things we have known before we had disease modifying treatments, a certain, you know, percentage of people who had relapsing MS then, transitioned into what we call progressive MS over time. Sometimes people will refer to that as what we call secondary progressive MS because it came after secondary because
Mm.
it came after the
After, right,
relapses
right.
after. Um, but the one of the things I'd say to your audience though is that this is where having now nearly 20 treatments has been so important, because what we are learning is that if you can start a treatment when a person is diagnosed with relapsing MS today, you can push off that secondary progressive MS into decades and beyond. And some people don't even go there. Um, and so, this is the emphasis, particularly in today's era, where if a person is diagnosed with MS and the doctor says, I don't really have any treatments for you, they're just flat wrong. We have over 20 ways of treating MS today. And so, one, I wouldn't expect a doctor to say that, but if someone
Hmm.
did, find
Right.
a different doctor,
I
because
go,
there are so many
please.
treatments out there. And we are focused on very much on what we need to do for progressive MS too. And so that's the next challenging frontier that we're focused on.
Okay, that's like how positive you are in terms of
you know
the medication, and people can't actually get help for this.
exactly. I mean, the landscape, I will say for your audience, is, actually next, on, I think next month sometime, I think July 15th or something like that, it'll be 30 years since we had the first disease modifying treatment approved for MS in the United States, the
Nice.
drug called betaseron. Today we have like more than 20 treatment strategies that can be used, and more coming. And so the landscape has changed. I mean, there hasn't been more progress in a neurological disease than there has been in MS. So it's a really good news story. But I'd also say, I'm sure, to your audience, for those who live with MS, they would also say, yeah, that's great. But, we still have other things like I live with pain, I live with fatigue, I have cognitive challenges. The healthcare system doesn't work to help me. And so
Some of
those are
those
all
needs.
the things that, when in my work at the National MS Society, what we're really trying to do is what we call change the journey of MS completely, so
Nice.
that people get diagnosed early, can they start a disease modifying treatment early, and then they can get on with life and live the life they want. And we know that we still have work to do, but the positive thing I would also say is that we've also seen how MS has been transformed.
Whew. Okay. All right. We take that in. So for the different stages, you spoke about the relapsing and the progressive.
Mhm.
So how can they be managed or controlled? I mean, we spoke about the over 20 ways of treatment, but at least give us like two of them.
So there are different types of treatments. So there are
Okay.
some that, there's one called Ocrevus, which is an infusion
Yes.
treatment where that
Yes.
gets, and basically what that is, you go to the doctor every 6 months, they put, stick a needle into your veins, they infuse this drug into your system. And what the way that treatment works is it targets specific immune cells in your body called B cells, and it
Okay.
goes right to those B cells. And we know those are misbehaving in MS. and so it basically kills those cells and removes them from your body, but leaves your immune system intact otherwise, and you're able to fight off infections and do a lot of different things. And every 6 months you go in and you get a treatment. And basically what we're learning is that particularly if you have relapsing MS, this type of treatment and some others that are like it that target B cells really cuts down the number of relapses people have, so they don't have very many relapses. And people will say, I haven't had a relapse in 10 years sometimes. And
Mm.
so this is really amazing. There are other treatments that are, injections, or they're a pill that, also target other parts of the immune system, where they'll target other cells that are involved in MS. And the goal with all of these is to be able to basically, like I said, act as a brake on the behavior of a person's immune system. And so we want to keep your immune system intact because you
Yes.
need to fight off infections. So that's really
Right.
important. And at the same time, we also need to ratchet that down. The vision of how we think about treating MS in the future, and this is what researchers and companies are working on, is that you could get to the point where you're really giving somebody a very specific treatment that says, okay, we're only targeting these types of cells in a person's body at this time. And then our hope is to say, okay, we're going to turn the immune system off over here, and at the same time, focus on rebuilding the brain and rebuilding the nervous system. And this is one of the longer term sort of scientific strategies, but also what it could mean for people with MS is that, the doctor talks to you about, we're going to give you this treatment to turn down the immune system and prevent the damage, but we also know there's damage there. And we want to accelerate the body's ability to heal itself by giving you this treatment that will promote your body's natural ability to repair itself. And that's another really important point, is that the thing about MS that we're learning is that, a person's brain and their spinal cord, we used to say, you know, the cells you're born with in your brain are, they're what you have, and the brain doesn't really have the ability to repair itself. Well, that's not true. It turns
Mm.
out the body does have its ability to repair itself, and the brain can repair itself. What we need to do is create the conditions so that it does that. And so that's, again, science that's been unearthed over the last 10 years. When I started working in MS research, 25 years ago or so, we didn't think that we could rebuild the brain. Well, now we're talking about how do we rebuild the brain, and so
Nice.
it's a reason to be optimistic about where the community is going.
I love that. But Tim, a question for persons who don't like injections
Hmm.
or don't want to take pills. What are the other options that they have?
So I think those are right now, those are the treatments we have. I
Okay.
will say, there are things that we encourage people that, in addition, like if you were to take an infusion or take a pill, or if you're not going to do those options, really, a thing that I actively encourage folks that talk to me, said, I've been newly diagnosed, the doctors told me I'm going to start on this treatment, which I'm good with the treatment, but there's got to be something else I can do that I can take action around. And so there's a couple things I say. First off, um, if you happen to smoke, I say please reconsider that and find
Right.
treatment for
Hmm.
that, because that treatment, smoking, we know from work that's been done in Sweden and other countries where they've followed people very specifically with MS, that it's not so much the act of smoking, it's the smoke itself.
Right.
Smoking amplifies some of the negative effects of MS and the progression. And if you stop, it can actually slow down the progression of the disease. So it is an act. It is something a person can do. So again, I don't want to make assumptions for our audience, but just say we know that that does accelerate progression. And if you want to take an action to stop progression, that's one thing you can do. Another thing to do is look at diet, and and really think about what's the diet that you have. There's no one very specific diet that we recommend, but a low fat diet, Mediterranean style diet, really focusing on trying to remove salt from the diet can make a difference. And then the last piece is to also embrace well-being, exercise, mindfulness. Those are all things that we talk a lot about today, but one of the things that we also know from the research is things like exercise increasing a person's metabolism have beneficial effects on the brain, and we notice that that actually has particularly helpful things for people with MS as well. So those three things I would say would be actions anybody should take, and it would be a way that, friends of mine who are like, I'm not really so into I'm taking drugs. I would say, again, talk with your doctor, find the what might work for you. But again, these are some things that people can take action on.
I actually like how you started by reconsider these things. Because telling some people to stop sometime they don't want to. So
Yeah.
reconsider stopping these and
it-
see if it will help, because these things probably help. And I'm gonna add stress.
oh,
Have less
absolutely.
stress.
Managing stress, and look, I'll be the first to tell you, I'm carrying around more weight than I need. I don't exercise. I mean, I try to walk and get exercise. I could always do more. And I'm a real fan of the book Atomic Habits by James Clear, which is really, he talks about, if you want to make a change, just think about what's 1% difference that you can do in something. And
Hmm.
anybody, can think about changing something 1%. But if you do 1% per week over a year, you've made 50% change. So
Yep.
it's, shrinking the change is the important thing. And like I said, everybody had, life is life. And so we just want to be able to, empower, our goal is really to empower people, to let them know, we're here to be a supportive partner to you, and, to help them navigate their journey.
Very nice. I love that. So, I mean, you answered part of it for the lifestyle changes or modifications that we can make to help with MS. But I want to know, like, all right, for the treatments available, we have to first of all be diagnosed first,
Exactly.
right? And I'm gonna also emphasize by a doctor or a neurologist, not by Google. I'm gonna emphasize that. No, because listen, we have a tendency to go to Google before we go to any doctor.
I absolutely, and I think, it being able to see him by a doctor, and really, I'd say the other thing that's really super important is, if you've been told by a doctor who's not a neurologist or an MS specialist, you have multiple sclerosis. One of the things, I mean, the doctor may be right, but I always recommend get the diagnosis confirmed by a specialist who knows MS, or get a second opinion around that, because the really important thing is that these treatments that I'm talking about have been very powerful, have made a big difference, and are also very powerful, and so they have an effect on you. And so it's important before you start a treatment to make sure that your doctor has properly diagnosed you as having MS. And that's just, that happens sometimes. People get misdiagnosed, and so that's just a piece of advice I give also.
Right. And also, I think I want to add to that in terms of after the diagnosis is made or such, that you also let your doctor know exactly what's
Yeah,
happening with your body, everything that's taking place.
exactly.
As you said earlier in our conversation, genetics or whatever can also cause it. So giving them the relevant information about us from we know what's happening. And as you said, have you always had a twitch in your hand? Have you always had these feelings? Have you always only you can only see out of one eye, really? The other
It,
eye look like they're
exactly.
clothes and it's not cloudy. Things like that. Let the doctors know all that information so that they can better diagnose you and they can better help you.
Exactly. And embracing your doctor as a partner. And also, the other thing to say is that, there are many aspects about MS that require other doctors. So sometimes people will see a physical therapist because they're having trouble walking, or they need to see a urologist because they have bladder issues. And it's just,
Mm,
oftentimes you need a team around you. And one of the hardest parts is that, getting all these people coordinated can feel like,
yeah, can be. Yeah, it
can be a
can.
frustration. But by the same point, what I'd say is knowing that, one, you have, you are your best advocate, but also I'll say this is why we exist as a National MS Society. We're here because there are people who live with MS. It's the only reason we're here. We're trying to find a cure. We're investing in research to find a cure, but also this is where we have programs like our MS Navigator program, where we can be there to help people and guide them, and be a resource to them as they're navigating the challenges, like how do I disclose that I live with MS at work? Because some people, that can be a scary
Yeah.
thing. And
Yes.
so we have these programs. This is why we exist, to be able to provide people, because we're here because we want to cure MS, but also alongside that, we want to empower people to live powerfully. And we know that they do that when they have, support and a guide around them.
Awesome. So, as you spoke about team not too long ago, we need a team of persons around us. For those persons who don't want to take these medication because they're afraid of side effects
Mm-hmm.
that will happen to them by taking it. Um, Yet, even though they have a team around them that will help them with it, the side effects sometimes it's concerning to them because reading sometimes these drugs, and sometimes you read the side effect is death. You're wondering, should I really go ahead and take this medication?
Mm-hmm.
So, for those persons who have issues with that, what would you say to them?
Yeah, no, and I'd say, first of all, I understand completely. You read the pages and pages, and you're like, wow, this is a significant side effect. A couple things I would offer. One is this is where you want to have a conversation with your doctor to understand how often does that happen? Am I in the profile to get that? If I did have that side effect, what would be my options? And that's the good news about where we are in MS and treatment strategies is if there is a side effect, there are other treatments that a person can try that don't have some of those side effects.
Right,
And so those are the things to really ask the question, and then also just to really engage your doctor and sort of like, what is on your mind, what are the considerations, what are the steps somebody could take perhaps to mitigate that, like, is if taking a pill is not a daily pill is not your thing, would an every 6 month infusion be
right, work for
better?
you.
And to look to explore that and really engage the doctor, but also they'll often have, the doctors are great to talk to, but I would also say talk to the nurses in the doctor's office. The nurses really can be such incredible supportive partners
Okay,
to people
okay,
as they're moving through. So those are some of the thoughts I'd have.
okay. I like that. In terms of treatments, the treatments
Mhm.
available, and the financial
Mhm.
cost for it.
Yep.
I think people are concerned about the financial cost that it's going to
Right.
occur for them. How do we go about that? How do persons go about that?
Yeah, so that's really another important consideration because the treatments are expensive, especially if you don't have
Insurance.
insurance.
Mm-hmm.
And so a couple of things. One is, if a person is, part of a commercial insurance, let's say you have health insurance through your employer or family, however it may be,
Right.
the companies particularly, provide, pretty significant patient assistance programs to help people manage the cost. But also, sometimes those copays still can be quite high. And
Yes.
so this is where, there are organizations that provide, help for individuals who may need some support in that way. We as the National MS Society also really have been focused very strongly on the cost of the MS medications because, our view is there's no point in having treatments if people can't afford them.
True.
And so, we understand that, because of the sort of the uniqueness of the United States, how prices are set in the United States are different perhaps than they are in other parts of the world. But, you're right. No amount of innovation is helpful if only a small number of people can get to it.
True.
What we are what we so we raise our voices pretty loud around that with Congress and with the pharmaceutical companies, and some of them are will listen to us.
Right. Mm-hmm.
um, but I would also say to individuals that this is where are the resources we have through the society about how to appeal for your medication, how to find access for other lower cost alternatives that can be out there, and also in terms of connect you to resources either through patient assistance programs that the companies make available, but also so different foundations that are out there. I'm not going to say that it's easy. Sometimes these can be very challenging
Right.
kinds of things to navigate, but the what my observation is that there are organizations that people want to make sure that individuals can get on their treatment. And the last thing I would also say is this is another area that if a person is talking to their doctor and their doctor is sort of saying, well, let's try this or that, one of the things is just to raise to the doctor, I just want to make sure that this is a treatment that, I can afford.
Yes.
And oftentimes the doctors don't think of that angle.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's a part of, again, about being your own advocate
Advocate. Mm-hmm.
and to emphasize that.
Hmm. I love that. How can our family members and friends support someone with MS?
Another really super important thing. So the first thing is um, engaging and being supportive of the person living with the disease, and recognizing that MS is something that can come and go in a person, and that things like fatigue, which is oftentimes people with MS will say this is really affects them. It really it, they could be really tired because it's their MS, and so being understanding about how the disease can wax and wane is really important. Being a supportive partner, listening to them, and just sometimes the most important thing you can do is just be present. You don't need to ask a lot of questions or
Right.
give a lot of advice. People with MS get tons of advice.
Mm.
um I think avoiding certain things, like often people with MS will say that the most frustrating thing is people will say to them, but you look so good.
Oh
And they're
my.
like, yeah, yeah, I look so good, I feel not so good inside. And just really being there, being there for people, being able to be with them and be advocates for them, is important. And
And let's
just,
just be mindful.
yeah, just be mindful. And just it's families are complicated, but as always. But I think the most important thing that people can be is just to be. Sometimes the most important thing is just to lend an ear and listen.
Two sided said families are complicated. Oh my
you know,
goodness.
everybody, everybody's family is complicated, which is okay. But I think in something like MS, particularly because MS, you can have somebody who lives with MS, who's incredibly physically fit, and then will also tell you that they're living with constant pain.
Hmm.
And so they can look awesome and also be struggling because of the pain that they're navigating because of their MS. And
Oh,
so this is where there are these invisible symptoms of the disease, invisible aspects of it that people don't see on the outside. And this is where, again, a supportive partner, family, friends really can make a big difference.
awesome. I love that. I love how you ended. Before we go, Tim, is there anything that you want to leave with our audience?
Most important thing I would say to your audience is that, if you've been told you have MS, I want you to know that you're not alone. There's a community out there of people who live with MS who are with you. There's a movement of people who are trying to make a difference. We're here as the National MS Society to be a support to you. And, the most important thing is to say you are not alone.
Yes.
um, and that to really reach out and to find the community you need to get support.
Mm-hmm. I agree with that. Annie, can you let us know where is it that we can connect with you or even, find information about
Sure.
MS?
So the best place to go for information, if you Google National Multiple Sclerosis Society, you'll find us. Otherwise, the website is nationalmssociety.org. And if you're looking for me, the one place I am on social media, if people are looking for me, is LinkedIn, is where you'll
Hmm.
find me. That's
Yes.
where you found me.
Yes.
That's my LinkedIn is my social media of choice. You'll see information where I post and talk about different things related to MS. And there's a range of other things. The National MS Society has a very active Facebook page, a Facebook community, as well as we're pretty active on LinkedIn, on Instagram as well, if you want for other stories of support. So those are great places to go for inspiring stories of support and to sort of see how people are navigating the journey of MS.
Awesome. Well said. Well done. Thank you so much, Tim.
Hey, thank you. It was my pleasure.
Thank you so much for listening to The Unfiltered by Jade, and we'll be back next week, Tuesday. Thank you.